The morning of August 9th, 1941, somewhere east of Vitebsk, in what had been Soviet Belorussia 3 weeks earlier, Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann crouched beside the Wurfrahmen launcher, mounted on his unit's SDKFZ 251 half-track, his hands working methodically to secure the final 280mm rocket into its wooden frame. The weapon looked absurd, he thought, not for the first time. 6 crude wooden crates bolted to each side of the vehicle, each crate holding a single massive rocket. It resembled something a desperate engineer had sketched on a napkin rather than a precision instrument of modern warfare. Yet, in 3 weeks of Operation Barbarossa, Klaus had learned that appearances meant nothing. The Wurfrahmen 40, despite its improvised appearance, despite the way veteran artillerymen laughed at its crude construction, had become something else entirely on the Eastern Front. Not just a weapon, but an instrument of psychological destruction so effective that Soviet soldiers abandoned positions before the rockets even landed. Klaus had joined the Wehrmacht in 1938, a printer's apprentice from Stuttgart who'd been drafted into the artillery. He'd expected to serve with the traditional field guns, the 105mm howitzers, or perhaps the massive 150mm pieces that formed the backbone of German artillery doctrine. Instead, after basic training, he'd been assigned to a newly formed Nebelwerfer unit, part of the experimental rocket artillery program that the High Command was developing in secret. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The training had been brief, almost dismissive. The Nebelwerfer smoke thrower in German was officially designed to lay smoke screens, though everyone knew its real purpose was to deliver high explosive and chemical warheads. The 6-tube launcher on its wheeled carriage could fire 150mm rockets out to nearly 7,000 meters, covering target areas with a saturation barrage that conventional artillery couldn't match for speed. But the Wurfrahmen 40 was something different. Klaus's unit had received the first prototypes in June 1941, just days before Barbarossa launched. The weapon wasn't a precision launcher like the towed Nebelwerfer. It was a mobile platform, a half-track fitted with 12 crude wooden frames, 6 on each side, each designed to hold a single 280mm rocket. The rockets themselves were repurposed from the Schwer's Wurfkörper 40, a towed launcher designed for siege operations. The entire system looked like a field modification, something desperate troops might cobble together from salvaged parts. Klaus remembered his commander, Hauptmann Werner Kessler, briefing the crews before the invasion. "Gentlemen," Kessler had said, standing before the peculiar-looking vehicles, "I know what you're thinking. This looks like a weapons designer's nightmare. But I assure you, what this system lacks in elegance, it more than compensates for in effect." Kessler had been right, though not in the way Klaus had anticipated. The Wurfrahmen's effectiveness wasn't primarily in its destructive power, though the 50-kilogram high-explosive warheads were certainly devastating. The real weapon, Klaus had discovered, was the sound. The 280mm rockets produced a howl during flight that was unlike anything in the Wehrmacht's arsenal. Not the whistle of conventional artillery shells, not even the distinctive shriek of the smaller Nebelwerfer rockets. This was a rising, oscillating scream that seemed to tear through the air itself, a sound that bypassed rational thought and triggered something primal in anyone who heard it. Soviet soldiers had begun calling it the Howling Cow, though Klaus learned this only later from interrogated prisoners. The German crews had their own nickname, Stuka zu Fuß, the walking Stuka, named after the Ju-87 dive bombers, whose sirens had terrorized enemy troops during the Polish and French campaigns. But the Stuka's siren was a deliberate psychological weapon, a wind-driven device added specifically to create fear. The Wurfrahmen's howl was an accident of physics, the result of the rocket's crude stabilization fins and the way air moved across them during flight. That accident had become the weapon's defining characteristic. Klaus finished securing the rocket and stepped back, surveying his work. Each of the 12 rockets weighed nearly 100 kilograms fully loaded. Loading them manually onto the high-mounted frames required strength and careful coordination. A dropped rocket wouldn't necessarily explode, but it would certainly be damaged beyond use, and supplies were already becoming a concern this far into Soviet territory. Zimmermann, Unteroffizier Hans Dietrich, called from the half-track's driver position. "How much longer? The battery commander wants us ready to move in 10 minutes. Almost finished," Klaus replied, moving to check the electrical firing system. The Wurfrahmen's salvos were electrically triggered. All 12 rockets fired in rapid succession with about half a second between each launch. The entire salvo took perhaps 6 seconds from first rocket to last, creating a walking barrage that covered the target area with methodical precision. Klaus had witnessed the effect during the battle for Minsk 2 weeks earlier. His battery of 6 Wurfrahmen half-tracks had been positioned to support the 7th Panzer Division's assault on Soviet defensive positions north of the city. The target was a fortified machine gun complex that had held up the advance for 6 hours, inflicting casualties on every German probe. The battery commander had positioned them 2,000 meters from the Soviet lines, just within the rocket's effective range. Klaus remembered the order to fire, the way his hands had moved automatically through the firing sequence, and then the sound as 72 rockets launched almost simultaneously from the 6 vehicles. The howl had been overwhelming even from the firing position. Klaus had watched through binoculars as the rockets arced toward the Soviet trenches, trailing smoke, that terrible scream building as they flew. The first impacts came after about 12 seconds of flight, and Klaus had seen something he hadn't expected. The Soviet soldiers had broken before the rockets landed, not after experiencing the explosions, not after witnessing the destruction. They'd broken during the flight, while the rockets were still screaming through the air. Men had abandoned their positions, running to the rear, and when the rockets finally impacted, the machine gun complex was already half abandoned. The follow-up infantry assault had encountered minimal resistance. The few Soviet soldiers who remained were stunned, uncoordinated, their defensive positions compromised by mass desertion. The panzers had pushed through within an hour. That night, Klaus had helped interrogate a captured Soviet lieutenant. The man had been visibly shaken, not just by capture but by something deeper. Through a translator, he'd described the rockets. "We've trained to resist artillery," the lieutenant had said. "We know how to take cover, how to endure bombardment. But that sound, that wasn't artillery. That was something else. It gets into your head. You can't think, can't focus on your duty. You just want it to stop, and the only way to make it stop is to run." Klaus had filed that conversation away, not fully understanding its implications. He was a soldier, a technical specialist responsible for operating his assigned weapon system. Psychological warfare was someone else's concern, something the propaganda ministry or intelligence officers worried about. But as Operation Barbarossa progressed, as the Wehrmacht drove deeper into Soviet territory, Klaus began to understand that the Wurfrahmen's psychological effect wasn't a secondary benefit. It was the primary weapon. The German advance in the summer of 1941 had been unprecedented in military history. 3 army groups, totaling nearly 4 million Axis troops, had smashed across the Soviet frontier on June 22nd, achieving a surprise so complete that many Soviet units were caught still in their barracks. Army Group Center, which Klaus's unit supported, had advanced over 300 kilometers in the first week, encircling massive Soviet formations at Białystok and Minsk. The speed of the advance created problems that German military doctrine hadn't fully anticipated. Supply lines stretched thin, ammunition expenditure outpaced production. The vast distances of the Soviet Union, so different from the compact theatres of Poland and France, meant that even rapid advances left the Wehrmacht far from its objectives. In this context, weapons that could achieve disproportionate effects with minimal ammunition became invaluable. The Wurfrahmen carried only 12 rockets, and reloading required time and exposed crews. A conventional artillery battery could sustain fire for hours, expending hundreds of shells. But a single Wurfrahmen salvo, lasting 6 seconds, could break enemy morale so completely that follow-up bombardment became unnecessary. Klaus had seen this pattern repeat throughout July and into August. His battery would be assigned a target, usually fortified positions or concentration areas, where Soviet units were attempting to establish defensive lines. They would position the half-tracks, conduct hasty firing solutions, and launch their salvos. The howl would echo across the battlefield, and more often than not, the Soviet positions would collapse before German infantry even began their assault. The weapon's effectiveness created an unusual dynamic. Traditional artillery crews took pride in accuracy, in the technical skill required to place shells precisely on target. They calculated firing solutions, using complex mathematics, adjusted for wind and temperature, maintained meticulous records of barrel wear and propellant consistency. The Wurfrahmen required almost none of this. The rockets were unguided, their accuracy poor by artillery standards. A salvo might land anywhere within a 200-meter radius of the aim point, but precision didn't matter when the goal was psychological disruption rather than physical destruction. This bothered some of the traditional artillerymen. Klaus had overheard conversations in the battery area, older NCOs complaining that the Wurfrahmen wasn't real artillery, that it was a terror weapon unworthy of professional soldiers. Hauptmann Kessler had addressed this directly during one morning briefing. "I've heard the complaints," Kessler had said, his tone neutral but firm. "Some of you feel that the Wurfrahmen lack the dignity of proper artillery, that we're simply frightening the enemy rather than destroying them through skill and precision." He'd paused, letting the words hang in the morning air. "Let me be clear about our mission. We are not here to satisfy our professional pride. We are here to break the enemy's will to resist, by whatever means prove effective. If the sound of our rockets causes Soviet soldiers to abandon their positions, then that sound is our weapon. If achieving victory requires us to terrify rather than simply kill, then we will terrify." Klaus had understood the logic, but understanding didn't eliminate unease. There was something disturbing about a weapon whose primary effect was psychological rather than material. It felt less like warfare and more like something else. Something that exploited vulnerabilities that soldiers shouldn't be expected to overcome. He pushed these thoughts aside as he completed his pre-firing checks. The battery had new orders, a fire mission against Soviet positions near a town called Yartsevo, where Red Army units were attempting to establish a defensive line blocking the road to Smolensk. Intelligence reported heavy fortifications, multiple machine gun positions, and at least one regiment of infantry. The Wurfrahmen battery would fire first, before the conventional artillery, before the Luftwaffe close air support, before the infantry assault. Their mission was simple: break the defenders' cohesion through psychological shock, creating the opening that exploitation forces would use to penetrate the Soviet lines. Klaus climbed into the half-track's rear compartment, checking the electrical firing panel one last time. Each rocket had its own circuit, 12 switches that would close in sequence when he pressed the master firing button. The system was crude but reliable, requiring minimal training to operate. "All vehicles, report ready," Dietrich called from the driver's seat. The radio crackled with confirmations from the other 5 Wurfrahmen in the battery. 72 rockets, ready to launch, ready to unleash that howling scream across the battlefield. Klaus waited for the fire order, his mind quiet, focused on the technical procedures that had become automatic through repetition. He didn't think about the Soviet soldiers in those trenches near Yartsevo, didn't imagine their experience of the weapon he was about to employ. That way led to questions he wasn't prepared to answer, uncertainties that had no place in a soldier's mind during combat operations. The radio crackled again. "All vehicles, fire on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Fire!" Klaus pressed the master firing button. The first rocket ignited with a sharp crack, a gout of flame erupting from its rear as it lurched from its wooden frame. Half a second later, the second rocket fired, then the third, the sequence marching down the left side of the vehicle before switching to the right side frames. The noise inside the half-track was overwhelming, 12 massive rocket motors igniting in rapid succession, the vehicle rocking with each launch. Smoke engulfed the firing position, thick and acrid, and through it Klaus could hear the other vehicles firing their salvos, creating a rolling thunder that lasted perhaps 30 seconds as all 6 Wurfrahmen emptied their frames. Then, cutting through the launch noise, came the howl. 72 rockets in flight, their crude stabilization fins causing that rising, oscillating scream that had become the weapon's signature. Even at 2,000 meters distance, even knowing what was coming, Klaus felt something primitive stir at that sound. What must it be like, he wondered, to hear that approaching, to know those warheads were screaming toward your position, to have no defense except to press yourself into whatever cover existed and pray that the 50-kilogram explosives fell elsewhere. The first impacts came 12 seconds after launch. Even from the firing position, Klaus could see the explosions, massive geysers of earth and smoke erupting across the Soviet defensive line. The salvos had scattered somewhat unguided rockets, rarely achieved tight impact patterns, but the sheer volume of fire covered the entire target area. More importantly, Klaus knew the psychological effect was already taking hold. Soviet soldiers in those trenches were experiencing not just explosive impacts, but the cumulative trauma of the howl, the impacts, the knowledge that another salvo might come at any moment, that there was no way to predict when or where the next barrage would fall. Reload. Hauptmann Kessler's order came over the radio. Prepare for a second fire mission in 15 minutes. Klaus and his crew began the laborious process of manually loading 12 new rockets onto their frames. As he worked, lifting the heavy rockets, securing them into position, he found himself thinking about the Soviet lieutenant's words from weeks earlier. It gets into your head. You can't think, can't focus on your duty. Klaus understood the weapons that were killed. He understood explosives, ballistics, and the stirred mathematics of destruction. But this weapon did something different, something that bothered him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. It reached past physical defenses into something more fundamental, exploiting psychological vulnerabilities that no amount of training or discipline could fully overcome. Was this innovation or exploitation? Military necessity or something darker? Klaus had no answers, only the weight of the next rocket he lifted onto its frame, only the knowledge that in 15 minutes they would fire again, and that howl would echo across another battlefield, breaking another group of soldiers who had no defense against a weapon that targeted their minds rather than their bodies. The Wehrmacht's advance continued, and the Wurfrahmen continued firing, and Klaus Zimmermann continued loading rockets and pressing firing buttons, and trying not to think too deeply about what it meant to wield a weapon whose primary effect couldn't be measured in casualties or destroyed equipment, but only in the invisible wounds it left in soldiers' minds. By September 1941, Klaus Zimmermann had fired the Wurfrahmen in anger more than 30 times. His battery had supported operations from Minsk to Smolensk, from Smolensk to the approaches of Moscow itself. The pattern had become routine: position the vehicles, conduct firing solutions, launch the salvos, reload, and move before Soviet counter-battery fire could locate their position. Mobility was essential. Unlike towed artillery that required time to unlimber and emplace, the Wurfrahmen could fire directly from the half-track chassis, then displace within minutes. This made them difficult targets for Soviet artillery, which struggled to locate and engage the German rocket launchers before they moved to new firing positions. But mobility created its own problems. The half-tracks consumed fuel at alarming rates, especially during the rapid advances of summer. Ammunition resupply became increasingly difficult as supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of Soviet territory. By late August, Klaus's battery was often reduced to firing partial salvos, conserving rockets for critical missions when their psychological effect would be most decisive. The weapon's effectiveness had not diminished. If anything, its reputation had grown among Soviet troops. Klaus learned from intelligence summaries that Soviet soldiers had multiple nicknames for the Wurfrahmen: the Howling Cow, Stalin's organ played backwards, the Screaming Death. Soviet political officers were instructing their troops that the German rocket launchers were less dangerous than they sounded, that the noise was deliberate psychological warfare designed to break morale. These instructions rarely worked. Klaus had witnessed this firsthand during an engagement near Vyazma in early October. His battery had been assigned to support an assault on Soviet positions that had held firm for 3 days despite repeated attacks. The Soviet defenders were well entrenched, their positions expertly sited to cover the approaches with interlocking machine gun fire. The battery fired a full salvo at dawn. Klaus watched through binoculars as the 72 rockets arced toward the Soviet trenches, their howl building to that characteristic crescendo. The impacts were devastating, but what happened next was more significant. Through the smoke and dust, Klaus saw Soviet soldiers emerging from their positions, not to counterattack but to retreat. They moved in small groups, abandoning their trenches despite no visible breakthrough in their defensive line. The follow-up German infantry had advanced almost unopposed. They'd found the Soviet trenches largely intact, machine guns still in position, ammunition still plentiful. The defenders hadn't been destroyed, they'd simply left. The weapon's reputation had done more damage than its explosives. This created an interesting dynamic that Hauptmann Kessler discussed during a briefing in mid-October. The Soviets are caught in a psychological trap, he explained to his officers and senior NCOs. Their troops fear the Wurfrahmen so intensely that political officers must constantly reinforce morale, insisting the weapon is less dangerous than it sounds. But this makes the soldiers feel that their fear is a personal weakness, a failure of revolutionary spirit. So when the rockets actually arrive, not only do they experience the terror of the weapon itself, but also shame at their inability to overcome that terror. This compounds the psychological damage. Klaus had noticed this in interrogations. Soviet prisoners who'd experienced Wurfrahmen barrages often seemed more disturbed by their own reactions than by the weapon itself. They'd describe breaking under fire as a moral failure, a betrayal of their comrades and their cause. The weapon didn't just frighten them, it made them ashamed of their fear. Was this strategic brilliance or psychological torture? Klaus found himself increasingly unable to separate the two. The Wehrmacht was achieving its objectives with minimal ammunition expenditure, breaking enemy resistance without the grinding attrition that characterized conventional artillery duels. From a purely military perspective, the Wurfrahmen were succeeding beyond any reasonable expectation, but Klaus couldn't shake the feeling that something about this success was wrong. Not morally wrong in some abstract sense, war itself eliminated most moral clarity, but wrong in a way that felt more fundamental. The weapon exploited vulnerabilities that humans shouldn't be expected to overcome, targeted psychological weaknesses that no amount of training or courage could fully address. He'd tried to articulate this concern to Hans Dietrich one evening in late October, as their battery occupied a temporary firing position west of Moscow. The early winter had begun, temperatures dropping, the muddy roads freezing into rutted ice. "Do you ever think about what we're doing to them?" Klaus had asked. "Not killing them, I mean. The other thing." Dietrich had been checking the half-track's engine, making adjustments to compensate for the cold. He'd paused, wiping oil from his hands. "You mean breaking them?" "Yes, breaking them, that's a different thing than defeating them." Dietrich had considered this for a long moment. "I think," he'd finally said, "that breaking the enemy is exactly what war is supposed to do. We're not here to fight honorable duels. We're here to make them stop fighting, by whatever means necessary. If terror works better than bullets, then terror is the correct tool." "But what does that make us?" Klaus had pressed. "If our weapon is fear itself, if we're deliberately causing psychological damage that will last long after the war ends." "It makes us soldiers follow orders," Dietrich had replied, his tone hardening slightly. "It makes us professionals doing our jobs. These are not questions for Obergefreiters to ask, Klaus. Leave the philosophy to the generals." Klaus had dropped the subject, but the questions remained. They grew more insistent as the Wehrmacht's advance toward Moscow stalled in November, as temperatures plunged to -30°C, as the Soviet resistance that was supposed to have collapsed instead hardened into determined defense. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Wurfrahmen batteries continued operating through the winter of 1941, though with increasing difficulty. The cold affected everything: rocket propellant performance, electrical firing systems, the half-track's engines and running gear. Ammunition supply became sporadic as the Wehrmacht's logistics system struggled to maintain forward units across vast distances in brutal weather. More significantly, the Soviet army was adapting. Klaus noticed this during a TAID 4 fire mission in December near Klin, north of Moscow. His battery had been assigned to suppress Soviet positions blocking a critical road junction. They'd fired their salvos according to standard procedure, expecting the usual pattern of psychological collapse followed by hasty German exploitation. Instead, Soviet return fire had arrived within 3 minutes. Accurate counter-battery fire forced the Wurfrahmen to displace immediately, abandoning their planned reloading cycle. The Soviets had evidently established forward observation posts with radio communication, allowing them to rapidly direct artillery fire against German rocket positions. More disturbing, the Soviet infantry hadn't broken. They'd remained in position despite the Wurfrahmen barrage, and when German assault troops advanced, they'd encountered prepared defenses and coordinated resistance. The psychological weapon that had seemed so effective in June and July was producing diminished effects by December. Hauptmann Kessler had addressed this in a sober briefing on December 18th. "The Soviets are learning," he'd said without preamble. "They're training their troops to endure the Wurfrahmen through repeated exposure. They're positioning anti-aircraft batteries to engage our half-tracks. They're organizing rapid counter-battery responses that force us to displace before we can deliver sustained fire." He'd paused, surveying his assembled crews. "More importantly, they're adapting psychologically. The weapon that broke entire regiments in July is now merely frightening. The Soviets are learning that the howl, however terrible, cannot kill them by itself. That if they remain in their positions, if they maintain their discipline, they can survive our barrages and continue fighting." Klaus had understood the implications immediately. The Wurfrahmen's primary weapon, fear itself, was losing effectiveness as Soviet troops gained experience with it. Repeated exposure was creating a form of psychological immunity, not complete but sufficient to maintain combat effectiveness despite the terror the rockets inspired. This was the fundamental weakness of psychological warfare, Klaus realized. Physical weapons destroyed material targets. A shell that destroyed a tank in June would destroy a tank equally well in December. But psychological weapons depended on the enemy's mental state, their inexperience, and their susceptibility to fear. As the enemy adapted, learned, developed counters, both tactical and psychological, the weapon's effectiveness degraded. The Wehrmacht's advance on Moscow failed in December 1941. For the first time in the war, German forces were not just stopped but pushed back, as Soviet counter-offensives reclaimed territory and threatened to encircle Army Group Center. Klaus's battery retreated westward through the brutal cold, the half-tracks struggling through snow and ice, ammunition supplies sporadic at best. During the withdrawal, Klaus experienced something he'd never encountered during the victorious summer advance. Soviet artillery fire directed with accuracy and persistence. The Red Army had learned to locate and engage German rocket launchers, treating them as priority targets. Klaus's battery lost 2 half-tracks to Soviet counter-battery fire in January 1942, killed before they could be displaced after firing. The psychological dynamic had reversed. Now it was the German crews who felt hunted, who knew that each time they fired, they exposed themselves to rapid and accurate Soviet response. The Wurfrahmen's mobility, once an overwhelming advantage, now felt barely adequate against an enemy who'd learned to anticipate their tactics. Worse, Klaus noticed that Soviet troops were no longer breaking when the rockets arrived. They'd learned to take cover at the first sound of the howl, to remain in their positions despite the terror, to continue fighting after the barrage was lifted. The weapon was still killed, still destroyed, but its psychological edge had dulled. By February 1942, Klaus had come to a disturbing realization. The Wurfrahmen hadn't failed, it had succeeded too well, too obviously. Its psychological effect had been so dramatic during the summer that Soviet commanders had prioritized countering it, both tactically and psychologically. They'd trained their troops specifically to endure the weapon, had organized their defensive doctrine around neutralizing its advantages, and had allocated resources to destroying the German rocket launchers that they might have used for other purposes. In trying to break Soviet morale through psychological warfare, the Wehrmacht had inadvertently strengthened it. Every Soviet soldier who endured a Wurfrahmen barrage without breaking became more resistant to the next barrage. Every unit that maintained cohesion, despite the howling rockets, gained confidence in their ability to resist German weapons. The terror weapon had created its own antidote through repeated application. Klaus discussed this with Hauptmann Kessler during a lull in combat in March 1942. The battery occupied winter positions near Rjev, dug in against Soviet attacks that came with predictable regularity. The situation had stabilized into grinding attrition, nothing like the rapid advances of summer. "Sir," Klaus had asked during a quiet moment, "do you think we made a mistake? With the Wurfrahmen, I mean, by making it so obviously a terror weapon?" Kessler had been studying a map, plotting firing positions. He'd looked up at Klaus's question, his expression thoughtful. "Explain your thinking." The psychological effect was so dramatic that it became the weapon's defining characteristic. Soviet commanders couldn't ignore it. They had to develop counters, both tactical and psychological. If the Wurfrahmen had been just another artillery piece, perhaps less obviously terrifying, maybe they wouldn't have prioritized countering it so heavily. Kessler nodded slowly. "You're suggesting that the weapon's greatest strength became its greatest weakness, that we revealed our hand too completely." "Yes, sir. We showed them exactly what we were trying to do, break their morale through fear. So they trained their troops specifically to resist that fear. If we'd been more subtle, if the psychological effect had been secondary to material destruction, maybe it would have remained effective longer." "Perhaps," Kessler had conceded. "But remember, we had no choice about the weapon's sound. The howl wasn't designed. It was an accident of the rocket's aerodynamics. We couldn't make it subtle even if we'd wanted to. The question is whether we exploited that accident too obviously, made the psychological warfare too explicit." He'd paused, then added, "Though I'll note that even if Soviet troops no longer break at the sound, they still fear it. They still take cover, still experience stress, still carry psychological wounds from repeated exposure. The weapon remains effective, just not as decisively as it was in June." Klaus had accepted this, but the conversation had crystallized something he'd been thinking about for months. The Wurfrahmen story was a case study in psychological warfare's limitations. Terror could achieve dramatic short-term effects, could break unprepared enemies, could create openings for exploitation, but terror also adapted enemies, taught them resistance, ultimately strengthened their psychological defenses in ways that conventional weapons never would. The war ground on through 1942 and into 1943. Klaus's battery continued operating, though the Wurfrahmen's tactical role evolved. It was no longer the decisive weapon that broke enemy morale before assaults. It had become simply one more artillery system, valued for its mobility and firepower, but no longer treated as psychologically special. Soviet troops still called it the Howling Cow, still took cover when they heard its distinctive scream. But they no longer broke. They'd learned to endure, and in learning to endure, they'd neutralized the weapon's primary advantage. Klaus survived the war, surrendering to American forces in May 1945. During post-war interrogations, he'd been asked about the Wurfrahmen, about its effectiveness, about German psychological warfare doctrine. He'd tried to explain what he'd learned, the paradox at the heart of terror weapons. The Wurfrahmen worked too well, he'd told the American intelligence officer. It broke Soviet troops so completely in the summer of 41 that their commanders had to respond. They trained their soldiers specifically to resist it, organized their tactics around countering it, and treated it as a priority threat. In making it so obviously a psychological weapon, we taught them how to defend against psychological weapons in general. The American had seemed skeptical. "So you're saying it would have been more effective if it had been less effective?" I'm saying, Klaus had clarified, that psychological warfare creates its own countermeasures. Every soldier who experiences terror and survives becomes more resistant to terror. Every unit that maintains discipline despite fear learns that fear can be overcome. We didn't just fight the Red Army with the Wurfrahmen. We inadvertently trained them to resist psychological warfare. The interrogation report had noted this observation but hadn't seemed to consider it particularly significant. The Americans were more interested in technical specifications, in industrial production capabilities, in tactical employment doctrine. The deeper lessons about psychological warfare's paradoxes held less interest. Klaus returned to Stuttgart in 1946, resuming his interrupted printing career. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service, avoided veterans' organizations, declined invitations to contribute to military histories. The Wurfrahmen had become a footnote in technical studies of rocket artillery, its psychological impact noted but not deeply analyzed. But Klaus carried the lessons with him. He'd operated a weapon that exploited human psychology's deepest vulnerabilities, that achieved devastating effectiveness by targeting fear itself. And he'd watched as that very effectiveness created its own defeat as the enemy adapted, learned, ultimately overcame the psychological weapon through nothing more sophisticated than repeated exposure and determined resistance. The years after the war were quiet for Klaus Zimmermann. He married in 1948, had 2 children, built a modest life around his printing business in Stuttgart. The city had been heavily damaged during Allied bombing raids, but reconstruction proceeded steadily through the 1950s. Klaus focused on the present, on providing for his family, on the technical challenges of his trade. But the Wurfrahmen never entirely left him. He would hear sounds, a passing truck with a poorly maintained engine, the whistle of wind through construction scaffolding, even certain musical instruments, and for a moment he would be back in that half-track, pressing the firing button, hearing that howl echo across battlefields from Minsk to Moscow. More disturbing were the nights when he would dream of Soviet soldiers in their trenches, hearing the rockets approach, experiencing terror that Klaus himself had delivered. He would wake in darkness, unsure whether these dreams were empathy or guilt, whether he was imagining their experience or remembering his own understanding of what his weapon had done to them. His wife, Anna, noticed but rarely asked directly. She'd learned that certain topics were closed, that Klaus carried experiences from the Eastern Front that he couldn't or wouldn't articulate. This was common among veterans. The war had ended a decade ago, but its psychological traces remained, manifesting in nightmares, sudden tensions, moments of dissociation that families learned to navigate without fully understanding. In 1959, Klaus received an unexpected letter. It came from a historical research institute in Hamburg, part of a project documenting German military technology during the Second World War. They were conducting interviews with veterans who'd operated specialized weapons systems, and they'd located Klaus's name through military records. Would he be willing to participate in an oral history interview about the Wurfrahmen 40? Klaus's first instinct was to decline. He'd avoided discussing his wartime service for 14 years and had built a life deliberately separate from those experiences. But something about the letter's careful phrasing, its emphasis on historical documentation rather than glorification, made him reconsider. He agreed to the interview, travelling to Hamburg in October 1959. The historian conducting the interview was Dr. Friedrich Hartmann, a younger man who'd been too young for wartime service but had devoted his academic career to studying German military technology with what seemed like genuine scholarly detachment. I'm interested in the Wurfrahmen's development and tactical employment, Hartmann had explained, setting up his recording equipment in a sparse university office. But I'm particularly interested in the psychological aspects. Contemporary reports suggest the weapon had effects beyond its material destructiveness. Klaus had nodded. The sound. That's what you're asking about. Yes. Multiple Soviet accounts mention the psychological impact. I'm trying to understand whether this was intentional design or a fortuitous accident. Accident, Klaus had said immediately. The howl was an unintended consequence of the rocket's stabilization fins, but once we recognized the effect, we absolutely exploited it. The interview had proceeded for nearly 3 hours. Hartmann asked detailed questions about technical specifications, tactical deployment, ammunition logistics, crew training, but he kept returning to the psychological dimension, clearly sensing this was where the weapon's real significance lay. Did you observe Soviet troops' reactions directly? Hartmann had asked. Sometimes, Klaus had replied, through binoculars during fire missions, or later when we'd advance through positions we'd bombarded, and through interrogations of prisoners. What did you observe? Klaus had paused, considering how to articulate experiences he'd spent years trying not to think about. Terror. Not just fear terror, the kind that bypasses rational thought. We'd see Soviet soldiers abandoning positions before the rockets even landed, just from hearing the sound. Political officers would try to maintain discipline, but the psychological effect was too strong. Did this trouble you? The question had hung in the air. Klaus remembered the careful neutrality he'd tried to maintain, the way he'd compartmentalized his role as simply a technical specialist following orders. But sitting in that Hamburg office, 14 years after the war's end, the careful compartmentalization felt like self-deception. Yes, he'd finally said. It troubled me. I understood we were exploiting psychological vulnerabilities that soldiers couldn't reasonably be expected to overcome. That felt different than conventional combat. Different how? Conventional weapons destroy bodies and equipment. Psychological weapons destroy something else, the capacity to resist, the sense of control, the belief that courage and discipline matter. When a shell kills you, at least you have a chance to be brave. When a weapon targets your psychology directly, courage becomes irrelevant. You break whether you want to or not. Hartmann had been writing rapidly, his expression thoughtful. Did you discuss these concerns with your fellow soldiers? Rarely. Most didn't want to think about it, and there was always the argument that we were simply doing our jobs, following orders, serving our country. Those moral questions were above our authority as junior enlisted men. But you thought about the moral questions anyway. I couldn't help it. Every time I pressed that firing button, I knew I was causing psychological damage that would last long after the explosions faded. That felt like a responsibility I couldn't entirely avoid through appeals to military hierarchy. The interview had concluded with Hartmann asking whether Klaus had maintained contact with other Wurfrahmen veterans. He hadn't, Klaus had explained. The weapons crews had been scattered during the war's final chaos, and he'd made no effort to reconnect after returning home. I think, Klaus had said as they'd concluded, that most of us wanted to forget. The Wurfrahmen wasn't something we were proud of. It was effective, yes, but effectiveness isn't the same as honor. We'd operated a terror weapon, and that's not a comfortable legacy. Hartmann's research was eventually published in 1961 as part of a comprehensive study of German rocket artillery. The Wurfrahmen chapter included substantial material from Klaus's interview, though his name was anonymized per his request. The book achieved modest circulation among military historians, but attracted little broader attention. The Cold War was entering its most intense phase, and historical examination of Second World War weapons technology seemed less urgent than contemporary strategic concerns. Klaus read the published chapter when Hartmann sent him a complimentary copy. He found it strange to see his words transformed into academic prose, his personal experiences converted into data points supporting historical arguments. But Hartmann had been respectful and had captured something essential about the weapon's psychological dimensions without sensationalizing them. One passage particularly struck Klaus. Hartmann had written, "The Wurfrahmen 40 represents a case study in psychological warfare's paradoxical nature. Its effectiveness in creating terror proved self-limiting, as repeated exposure allowed Soviet forces to develop psychological resistance. The weapon that broke enemy morale so decisively in summer 1941 had become merely frightening by winter 1942. This suggests that psychological weapons, unlike material ones, inherently create their own countermeasures through the very process of their employment." Klaus recognized his own observations in this analysis, but seeing them formalized in academic language created distance that was somehow comforting. These weren't just his personal experiences and questions anymore. They were historical patterns, observable phenomena that other researchers could study and analyze. The 1960s and 70s passed quietly. Klaus's children grew up, attended university, pursued careers with no connection to military service or wartime experiences. His printing business prospered modestly, enough to provide comfortable retirement when Klaus finally sold it in 1978. Retirement brought time for reflection Klaus hadn't previously allowed himself. He began reading more extensively about the Eastern Front, about Soviet experiences of the war, about psychological warfare's development and effects. He discovered that Soviet veterans had written their own accounts, many describing the Wurfrahmen and its psychological impact from their perspective. One account particularly affected Klaus. It was a memoir by a Soviet junior officer named Dmitry Vulov, published during Glasnost in the late 1980s. Vulov had served throughout the war, from the catastrophic initial retreat through the final advance on Berlin. His memoir devoted substantial attention to German rocket artillery and its psychological effects. The Howling Cow, Vulov had written, was different from other weapons. It reached past our physical defenses into our minds. It exploited vulnerabilities we didn't know we had, and it inflicted wounds that never fully healed. Klaus read this passage multiple times, struck by the recognition it expressed. Vulov was describing exactly what Klaus had observed from the other side, the psychological wounds that psychological weapons inflicted. But Vulov was also describing something Klaus himself experienced, the way operating such a weapon left its own psychological traces, different from, but not entirely separate from the trauma it inflicted on its targets. Klaus wrote to the Soviet publisher, uncertain whether the letter would be delivered or answered. He identified himself only as a German veteran who'd read Vulov's memoir with great interest, expressing appreciation for its honest examination of combat trauma. He didn't mention the Wurfrahmen specifically, didn't identify his own role in operating the weapon Vulov had feared. To his surprise, he received a reply 6 months later, in 1989, just as the Cold War was entering its final phase. Vulov had written back, his letter translated into German by someone at the publisher's office. "Thank you for your letter," Vulov had written. "It means much to know that German veterans also recognize the psychological costs of that war. We were all damaged by it, on both sides, in ways we're still learning to understand." The letter continued with reflections on memory and trauma, on the difficulty of conveying wartime experiences to those who hadn't lived through them, on the importance of honest historical reckoning. Wurfkörper made no reference to specific weapons or battles, just a general acknowledgement of shared experience across the lines that had divided them. Klaus never replied. What could he say? That he'd operated the very weapon Wurfkörper had described with such traumatic clarity? That he'd pressed the firing button that sent those howling rockets toward Soviet positions, knowing the psychological damage they would cause? The gap between their experiences felt simultaneously vast and negligible. They'd both been wounded by the Wurfrahmen, just in different ways. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. The Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991. Klaus watched these events on television from his Stuttgart apartment, feeling a curious mixture of relief and melancholy. The ideological conflict that had framed his entire adult life was ending, but its resolution couldn't undo the experiences that conflict had created. Klaus Zimmermann died in January 1994 at age 73. His funeral was well attended by family, former business associates, and a few remaining friends from his neighborhood. The obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service only briefly, noting he'd served in an artillery unit on the Eastern Front. Among his personal effects, his children found a small wooden box containing items from his military service. A few photographs, his Wehrmacht paybook, some letters Anna had sent during the war, and at the bottom, a technical manual for the Wurfrahmen 40, its pages yellowed, covered with notations in Klaus's precise handwriting. His son, Martin, who'd become an engineer, paged through the manual with curiosity. The technical specifications meant little to him: firing procedures, safety protocols, maintenance schedules for equipment, long obsolete. But one page contained a handwritten note in the margin, dated December 1942. The note read, "Effectiveness decreasing. Soviet troops no longer break at the sound. We trained them to resist us." What does this mean about psychological warfare, about exploiting fear? Every soldier who survives our terror becomes more resistant to it. We are teaching them courage through the very weapon meant to break their courage. This seems important, but I don't understand why. Martin showed the note to his sister, Elizabeth, who'd studied history at Heidelberg. She photographed it, thinking it might be historically significant, this fragment of an ordinary soldier's reflection on his weapon's effects. The photograph eventually found its way to a military museum in Berlin, where it was filed among thousands of similar artifacts, letters, diaries, photographs from the Eastern Front. A curator catalogued it with minimal annotation. Personal reflection by Wurfrahmen operator, December 1942. Discusses psychological warfare effectiveness. The Wurfrahmen 40 itself exists now primarily in museums and historical texts. A few examples survive in various states of preservation. The crude wooden frames and simple launching mechanisms displayed behind glass for visitors who rarely linger long. Technical specifications are documented, tactical employment analyzed, production numbers recorded. But the weapon's real significance, the thing that Klaus Zimmermann struggled to articulate in that marginal note, remains difficult to quantify. How do you measure psychological wounds? How do you calculate trauma's cumulative effects? How do you assess a weapon whose primary target was human psychology rather than human bodies? Soviet veterans like Dmitry Wurfkörper carried those psychological wounds for decades after the war ended. They experienced nightmares, anxiety disorders, exaggerated responses to sudden sounds, all symptoms of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. The Howling Cow's scream echoed in their minds long after the weapon itself had been retired from service. But German veterans like Klaus Zimmermann carried their own psychological burdens. Not the terror of being targeted by the weapon, but the moral weight of having deliberately inflicted psychological trauma, of having exploited human vulnerabilities for military advantage, of having pressed firing buttons knowing the invisible wounds those rockets would create. Both groups were casualties of the same weapon, just in different ways. The Wurfrahmen 40 had been designed to break enemy morale, and it succeeded, but success came with costs that military planners hadn't fully anticipated. Costs measured not in ammunition expenditure or mechanical reliability, but in damaged psychologies on both sides of the firing line. The historical irony Klaus had identified in his December 1942 note proved prophetic. Psychological weapons that work too well create their own countermeasures. Soviet troops adapted to the Wurfrahmen through repeated exposure, developing psychological resistance that eventually neutralized its primary advantage. The terror weapon that had seemed so effective in summer 1941 had become merely frightening by winter 1942 and familiar by 1943. This pattern psychological warfare, creating adaptive responses that reduce its effectiveness, has remained relevant in military conflicts since. Modern militaries continue grappling with similar challenges. How do you maintain psychological advantage when enemies adapt to psychological weapons? How do you train troops to resist psychological warfare without inadvertently strengthening them through the training itself? Klaus Zimmermann never claimed to have answers to these questions. He was an ordinary soldier who'd operated an unusual weapon, who'd observed its effects with increasing unease, who'd carried the experience for the rest of his life without fully understanding its implications. His marginal note in a technical manual, his reluctant interview with Dr. Hartmann, his unsigned letter to Dmitry Vulov, these were simply attempts to grapple with something that resisted easy categorization. The Wurfrahmen taught its operators and its targets different lessons, but perhaps the deepest lesson was shared, that war's psychological dimensions are as significant as its material ones, that weapons targeting the mind can be as devastating as weapons targeting the body, and that the scars from psychological warfare persist, long after physical wounds have healed. Klaus's story, multiplied across thousands of German soldiers who operated psychological weapons, and millions of Soviet soldiers who endured them, represents a reality that military histories often overlook. Not the grand strategies or decisive battles, but the intimate experience of psychological warfare's effects on both those who inflict it and those who survive it. The Howling Cow's legacy isn't primarily found in technical specifications or tactical analyses. It's found in the nightmares of Soviet veterans who heard that scream approaching, in the moral unease of German veterans who created that scream, in the recognition that some weapons wound in ways that never fully heal. Klaus Zimmermann pressed a firing button more than 30 times during the war. Each time, 12 rockets launched with that characteristic howl flew toward Soviet positions, inflicted terror and destruction in roughly equal measure. He survived the war physically intact, returned home, built a life, raised children, pursued a career. But some part of him remained in that half-track, finger on the firing button, listening to the howl he'd created echo across battlefields from Minsk to Moscow. Not because he wanted to remember, but because psychological warfare cuts both ways. It damages those who employ it as surely as those who endure it, just in different ways that take different forms, but persist with equal stubbornness across decades. This is the Wurfrahmen's truest legacy, not its technical innovation or tactical flexibility, but its demonstration that weapons can target human psychology with devastating effectiveness, and that such effectiveness comes with costs that extend far beyond immediate combat results. Costs measured in damaged minds and troubled consciences that persist long after the guns fall silent and the rockets stop screaming. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on 2i at your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.